Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years' experience with cybersecurity. 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
I'm super excited about this one. My buddy Ron is on the podcast with me. Ron saved my tail not too long ago in Canada, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point in this conversation. But Ron, why don't you introduce yourself, who you are, all your background, and let the audience know a little bit about you, bud.
All right, well, try to hide the Canadian accent. So thanks, Aaron A., for inviting me to your show. Hi, I'm Ron Brash. I'm the VP of Technology and Technical Research and Integrations at aDolus Technologies. What we do, we were kind of one of the first figures in the industrial space that was doing the DPAC analysis way back when Tofino. But aDolus, what we do today, what we're doing is we're doing binary analysis to decompose software into its constituent components and trying to wrap up all of that information, those insights, into a consumable package, if you will. And one of the many things that we can produce are software bills of materials. But that was a tertiary output to the primary goals of being able to unpack software starting circa 2017 from a DHS grant. So we've been around for the space for a long time, and thanks for bringing me on the show, Aaron.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, we hear S-bombs now, and that's kind of been this tertiary output of things. But the real meat and potatoes is being able to understand what these devices are, what they're doing, what their primary use case is. And obviously now we understand this, but, customers in the past, they didn't really understand, hey, I bought this controller from Honeywell or Emerson or GE or whomever it was. They don't really know what's embedded in it. They just bought it and put it in. Like, they didn't understand, and maybe they got vulnerabilities based on the firmware level, but they didn't really know what was behind the scenes of underneath. They didn't realize they were using open, VPN or open SSL or any of the other components that they're grabbing off the shelf and embedding into this code, and what that means, which means I don't know how to protect that because I don't know how to mitigate it. I don't know that it's a vulnerability. I don't know that those things are running in the background with, credentials and all these other things. So it's easy to look at the vulnerabilities of things, but not always think about maybe there's an open credential, maybe there's a port and protocol. Like, there's all these things that we need to consider when we're looking at all these really complex environments and OT systems.
Yeah, I've got names for that. I call them IOGs, indicators of garbage. I hope that takes off on it as an industry trend. I really do. I think I'd love to see that in marketing presentations everywhere. But when we're digging out those components, you're right. You're an asset owner. You bought a turbine. Well, to you, it's just one multi-million-dollar line item on the asset sheet. But there's all of the infrastructure that goes into it, the controllers, the DCS, there's the primaries, the secondary controllers, you have effluent management for coolant, you have relay substations and switchgear. All of that comes into that, but you don't realize that because you just bought, a 90, 180 megawatt peaker turbine, and that's what you bought. That's what you think, because you've unconsciously accepted the risk because you're just looking for that revenue generating asset, or you've purchased it or acquired it over time. So it's really tricky there. But then you're also thinking about it from another point, and many of the industrial OEMs are integrators to a certain sense. But when you're buying, let's say you're doing discrete manufacturing and you're buying a bottling lineup or something like that, though the company you're dealing with, again, is integrating and building this large solution into a machine cell or a skid. And inside of there will be your Rockwell, your Siemens, your Schneiders, all that stuff too. But to you, again, it's that line item, and you just bought all of that gear. You might see it on the BOM, but inside of those components, and let's say your HMI, your machine interfaces, you'll have like a Windows base, and then you'll have on top of it factory talk. You'll have all of those things like an OSI soft client to get data in and out. Those are all pieces that are going to be in this thing. And what's in the sauce? Well, that's kind of the premise of it. But again, it's not to panic because you're going to get a sea of red. It's to be able to put two and two together. Just because there's a risky bit there doesn't mean it's bad, because it's how it's used, it's context. It's just like what separates one identical PLC from another its use case and where it's used. And again, software will come down to that as well, right? If you have OpenVPN, okay, so why is OpenVPN there? Oh, it's a VPN concentrator to the edge. That's important. Now, if it's an VPN concentrator that's closer to a machine cell with several layers in between it, I'd be less inclined to worry about it. But again, it all comes down to that context. And I think actually that's a great way to probably start the next part of this conversation.
Yeah, and that context is so important, right? Because, man, I've walked into power plants and been an asset owner, right? And when we're doing, workflow with Maximo or anything, and we have these, the locations and the assets and all the asset information, a lot of times, you're exactly right. There's one line item that says Emerson Control System, right? How many components make up that Emerson Control System? Of course, when they delivered it, they got a bill of material, they got as-built documentation. But the only thing that's tracked is Emerson DCS, GE Mark 6 turbo control system, right? Whatever that thing is, but they don't have all of those subcomponents. And the main reason from an operational perspective, they don't need that. Not at that level in that location. Correct. But when we're looking at it from understanding how everything ties together, and so many times on the cyber side, we look at it as, you hear it in the news at least, nation state attacks and all these different things. And those are really true. Obviously that is happening. It is a vulnerability. It's something we need to look at, but it's also just understanding how these products work so that when I want to implement integrations with other third parties or with other systems, I know what it takes to make it work. And that I can make it work with these other things, and B, I'm not going to break either side by sending these things together. And ultimately that's a lot of this OT IT convergence thing that you hear about. I see it more so just I need to be able to connect these really complex systems and be able to get data in and out and be able to do OSI Pi and vibration monitoring and all these different things. And I need to have all that indication and control from my operator in a very easy way.
Yeah, I mean, I jokingly say convergence actually happened in the 1980s. Like, I don't know why this is a new thing 30 years, 40 years almost later, right? It's not new. I mean, it really started with when Microsoft computers started talking and SMB and DCOM started flying by. Convergence already happened at that point. I mean, let's just forget it. It already happened, especially when they shoved Modbus on top of a TCP frame years ago. Yep. So let's just get over this convergence word. It's to quote Tyler Williams, for right or wrong, it's all T. He's right. It is all T at the end of the day, with a wild card in front. So you're right. You're totally right. And it's really tough. I mean, I've worked on printing presses that have like 30 Siemens PLCs inside. Now, do I expect the asset owner to care that there's 30 inside there? Not necessarily, but he or she or they needs to understand that there is indeed n number of devices with I/O cards that are going to speak in these common tongues to each other. And that's one part of it. And then the other part is, if you know those things are there, then you can also start to negotiate things about your service contracts as well. Because ABC vendor might not want to talk to you after a support period. Or if you're unlike other vendors, they buy up other catalogs from portfolios of companies just to put that product in a state where it's end of life, and you're stuck with no alternative except for theirs. I mean, there was a recent acquisition today. Can't imagine why that might be. It's not just for the technology; it's to get rid of a competitor off the market. And that's been that's something that spans in these businesses that really are multi-generational, if you will. And that's a big piece there too. So it's really about not just knowing there, but being able to map those pieces too is going to be crucial moving forward, because when the economy goes down, you get lots of acquisitions and divestitures, and your asset's going to say, I don't know, let's say GE Fanuc, and now it should say Emerson, but it doesn't, because how are you going to go back and update the case? Those are all going to be pieces that'll help you in this journey. But I don't think anybody wants to become a historian or archaeologist of file names and products. I don't think.
Well, and that's a unique, when we look at the T is always the same, like you said, right? And the O side of it, if we really want to asterisk or O on that side, the difference on the operation on the OT side, right, is just, you just talked about that. There may be devices that have been out there for 40 years. And when I put them in, it was a GE, and then it got bought by XYZ Corporation and Acme and Bob's Your Uncle and whatever, right? But all along the way, it's still been this thing, and it's been running with this thing, and you have to be able to trace that back to understand what it is, and who do I call for support, and do I need a, many of these things, they don't have support. They're buying spare parts off of eBay or wherever they can find them, or from other, they're shutting down facilities, and they're going and they're skeletizing all of their old equipment and taking it to the rest of the fleet that's still running, because that's the only way they can keep it running, because it's so expensive just to replace things. And it's a completely different model than the IT side, right? IT, you got a 5-year life cycle, and you're replacing servers, you're replacing laptops, you're replacing everything. Everything in your environment is less than 5 years old, usually. Some of the older stuff, maybe 10, but you're not ever going to see anything in IT that's running for 40 years. And that's very common in the OT space.
I mean, when was the last time I've seen a catalyst switch that wasn't 10 years past end of life on a site visit? Never. I think they were 10 years end of life before they even got into the facility, because they were the leftovers from the corporate fleet, probably.
Yep.
Most likely, except for maybe some of the brand new greenfields. So this is just business as usual, but it really comes down to, can you equate? Do you know what you have? To a certain extent, I'm not saying boil the ocean. I think that's not a fair assessment. Yeah. But knowing where your crown jewels are and how they operate for SRP, safety, reliability, and productivity purposes. And you could even apply that to a regular business, whether that's an I in the T or it's an O in the T, those same principles still happen. Is the business running reliability? Yes or no? Is it being productive? Yes or no? Is it safe? Or like you could use safety and tweak it a bit towards like the informational aspect, but it's still true no matter what. And if people actually thought about those terms, I think we'd be a lot better off than looking at things like the CIA triad and trying to figure out where assets are and classify them.
Yeah, it just doesn't really fit the model, right?
No.
So talk about, like, obviously there's all this old stuff. There's all this, SBOM, and there's all these vulnerabilities in this space. And one of the things that I talk with a lot of folks, from being in my consulting days to being an asset owner, and even now in my role at Industrial Defender, but you walk into these spaces, they don't know what assets they have. They know they have really old stuff. So you telling me, hey, you've got, instead of 500 vulnerabilities that I know about, you're telling me I really have 10,000. What do I do with that? Like, walk through, how does that help? Like, what is the point? What's the value statement that we're bringing out that these asset owners, they need to know? And we're not trying to tell them to boil the ocean. At the same time, that doesn't mean you put your head in the sand and just pretend nothing's there.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll equate it back to something we all hopefully would like to know in our lifetimes, which is getting a home inspector report. And if you've got a very good home inspector, hey, everything's going to look terrible on this home. Everything will. I mean, this house that I'm in right now is 10 years old. Aaron, you know what it's like, so we can talk about that later. But it had basically been abandoned by 5 years by the owner, and then the bank had it for a little bit of time, and so I put some time into it. So when I got the home inspector report, it was like, this is wrong, and that is wrong, and this is wrong, and I'm like, I only have a limited budget here. Like, do I stay away from this? Even though I can do a few things with my hands. And then I really looked at it and said, okay, what's the most important piece? Structural. Okay, we got the structure part down pat. We got 4 walls and a door. We're probably okay then. We got a roof. There's a small little spot there, but that's not gonna cause a problem. Okay, do we have water, electricity? Those are good. Sanitation's good. Okay, everything else after that is just bonus points. Right. We got something that's structural we can work with. The reason why I'm using that as a point of reflection is that a lot of people, when they see things like that, or they go to a mechanic and they get this big list of things that's wrong, they start panicking. And in industrial, everything's about measured transitions and retrofitting. And that's no different than how you should think at your home. If you buy everything on credit, that's going to really hurt you today. But if you take a very measured approach to it, you'll be thinking exactly like a general manager at a facility, which is, I have end budget, contingency budget, and how do I map accordingly? So I like to think about that pragmatically. So when we see someone who doesn't know what the current vulnerabilities even mean in the first place, we're already at an educational point of view. We have to educate. The next piece that we're going to have to do is, how do we help them assemble that into something like a heat map so it's usable? So we've got this class of assets, depending on how they're used. One could be turning, just a very simple micrologics could be triggering a relay in my corner of my office, turning on the light switch. I'm not worried about that one over there, but I am worried about the one that's going to control, let's say, a pump that's monitoring some sort of mixing system. That I'm going to be more concerned about. And really, that's what I try to tell people is, you focus on the assets that matter to you. It's the same as the home analogy. Are you functioning? Can you function? Okay. Which are the ones that are closer to where you have contractors coming in and churning? Where are the ones closer to your incumbent vendors that are stuck on site, or live on site, I should say? Then you have ones that are closer to where the corporate side of things are, where the printers are, all of your basic stuff coming in from the data centers in the corporate office. You try to kind of work your way through that problem, just like you'd assess another problem for, let's say, how I'm going to do my home maintenance. What's important today? What's important in 3 weeks? What's important in a month? All of those same kind of processes. And that's how I think we're going to manage that sea of issues. And I think you'd do the same if hardware errata came out. You'd base your shutdowns and your changes based on the hardware errata. Well, what makes software any different? I couldn't tell you really at that regard.
Yeah, that's the key there, right? Is breaking it. How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Like, where do I need to focus my effort? If I had one hour of time or $1 to spend, where's the most value that I'm going to get by putting it out there? Is it, the analogy I give is very similar to what you used to have, right? I've got two PLCs that are exact same version. One's controlling the ice machine, one's controlling the turbine. They're not the same. They have the same vulnerabilities, but they're not the same risk to my business, right? If the ice machine shuts down, it's an inconvenience. If the turbine shuts down, it's a problem. They're two different things, right? So looking at that, we have to help change the narrative of, there's a couple of narratives that have frustrated me in the OT space, and I've seen my colleagues say it. I've seen many people think it, whether it's the news or, fire and brimstone, the sky is falling, but the goal is not to, it's not zero. So in OT, we're about availability. So IT folks would understand, like 5 nines. We want to have it always on, always available. And we don't, safety zero, the exact inverse. I want zero safety incidents. I don't want anybody to lose their life or limb, et cetera. All those are perfect goals, and that should be what it is. But on the cyber side, I don't think the goal is zero. And when I say by that is, it's probably not a popular opinion, but I'm not just, there is almost no way you can throw as unlimited amounts of money at it and you can still get infiltrated. Like, you can have it air gapped and behind data diodes and all of these things, and that's not going to stop, the code being on the PLC when you bought it and the supply chain brought it in, or when a vendor that you trusted and you scanned the thing, it came in and it wasn't detected by there's all these different ways that you have to protect, and you have to be perfect. We've got people and they're connecting things and they're trying to make things work and they're trying to make it available. It's almost impossible to never have an incident ever show up in these environments ever. Like, it's unrealistic. So the goal shouldn't be zero. The goal should be, hey, I want to be able to do as much detection or deflection and defense as possible. At the same time, I need to know where my gotchas are, and also really focus on recovery. Like, if these types of things happen, I want to narrow the scope so it's only impacting one small system, not my entire environment, not my entire fleet. And if that does happen, I can isolate and what is my recovery plan? How do I get back up and running? How do I do it safely? How do I do it quickly? And have those procedures. And all of that is not technology. A lot of that is process. A lot of that is people and training, and some of it is technology, but only part of it. It's not always a go buy this product or go pay for this service or go do those things. Sometimes it's train your people on how to rebuild from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, most of cybersecurity, at least in the industrial world, is the lack of engineering or the result of engineering, really, at the end of the day. And you're absolutely correct. And I wouldn't even say necessarily to recover. Sometimes you have to run in a degraded state. That's good enough for some of your shareholders. Yeah, you lost 20% per hour, but it's better than 0 per hour. And having a complete shutdown, which may cause further problems, because sometimes if you go to a full shutdown, then you are actually subject to safety things, which is, now you need to do repressurized testing. And then, there's that thing that would have shown up in that maintenance thing. Now you're going to be locked down even longer. So you're absolutely right on all of it. I mean, it's a question of people. It's a question of technology. It's a question of caring about your job. That's another big piece here. Some people are just waiting for the golden years and just getting the handshake on the way out. Maybe that's going to change as of someone else recently going to court. Maybe, you never know. And then some of it's just, you got to get your head out of the sand and just, plan for it, right? Like, sometimes the economy and the local community around these facilities is an intrinsic part. You don't think about that as the facility's operation and its purpose, but it's a side effect that leads to it. If that facility is up and running and everybody's happy, that means you have actually an influx of resources as well who are also keen to work in that facility, and that could also help your business as well. You can bring in fresh blood and all those cool things to keep the facilities up and running. There's so many different tangents that we could go on here. It's unbelievable, really.
So talk about when you guys walk into one of these facilities that it's an old system. I bought the one line that, hey, it's Acme pallet, and it's got, I don't know what's inside of it. Obviously it's got components, et cetera. How are you guys walking in and helping these asset owners understand what they have, what's embedded in that black box of things, and all the way down to, what are the protocol limitations? What are the issues that they need to be aware of? Again, not from a, hey, you need to rip this out or you need to patch it, but sometimes it's just, hey, you need to be aware of this so you know what to look for.
Yeah, so we don't do that anymore. That was in prior lives for Erica, myself, and the team.
Yep.
And then obviously when I was at Verb and so on. So, but I take those lessons with me because I think there's a couple of different cases here. There's what you believe to be in your asset inventory, and then what you do have. Those are two different things. And when you do finally get to that, can you query something? So we can provide data around that to help kind of guide that. But then you wind up with, here's all of the many things you need to look at. But I think one of the more important parts is once you've purchased, there's not much you're going to change about that, especially it's an operation. So what happens next is what does your next purchase look like?
Yep.
And that's where we try to redirect people is what do your new greenfield facilities look like? What do your brownfield that are being retrofitted? Can you make better selections on products? And that's where we start to help is, okay, so for every time you're going to go buy a new product, maybe think about getting a third party to actually look at it and attest to it. Maybe not get down to the nitty gritty that, like what would be the evaluation from a national lab. That's probably beyond what most asset owners would ever need. Mm-hmm. But if you're just trying to do an 80-20 Pareto rule, you can bring us in, we'll knock it down and say, yeah, you know what, this is some risky business here. And by the way, that's only one sample of the forklift solution you're about to buy. Is that really what you want? So there's that procurement preventative side, and you could even do that to justify the divesting or retirement of various assets as well, which is something would have done in the past to get rid of certain cellular modems that are completely terrible. And then you can also do the stuff which is part of your management of change process. So if you're in a highly regulated NERC-CIP environment, and this could be true in other industries too, and I suspect it will be, is for every work order that comes in with a software update, that software update has to be scanned and verified, ideally programmatically, so you can get the red flags out. And that's where you could submit it to various services like aDolus in some senses, and you could then pull out those pieces there and actually automatically throw it back to the participating party and say, this is terrible. I don't want more risk than I currently have, which in NERC-CIP land, you want to know that because you don't want to add more bureaucracy to the fire. And then you can also, because you've done that scan, you have basically a record of posterity. So for every new piece of software entering your facility, you can actually find where the log4js are in the future. Because if you tag it properly, now, okay, on that HMI, there's this, or it's, let's say, PulseNet or one of those things that's all Java based and it's got log4j, and you know it's going to be for VPN. At least you can track when it got added in the environment, on what assets it got added, and then you can start and quickly go catalog those things. SBOMs, for the purpose of SBOMs, is a terrible thing. For attestation, it's useful, but it's not the whole story. What's useful is those actionable bits, and that's like that management and change process. That's actionable and saves you when the fireman comes running. Yeah,
and that's a piece to, as we're building out these new systems, these greenfield sites, or even if it's not greenfield, it's the same scenario if I'm doing a control system upgrade, DCS upgrade, any of those types of things. Up until now, we haven't been looking at that level. Like, obviously they're doing FATs, they're making sure that the code works, it controls their endpoints, that kind of thing. But at no time, again, I've done many of these, they weren't ever looking at this. I wasn't looking at this. We were bolting on cyber after the fact. Like, I was even able to get it into the FAT, but it was only after the vendor's product. Like, I was never really able to dig into their platform and understand what was behind the curtain. So I just had to, after the fact, bolt on things to try to protect, the crunchy outside to make sure nothing got in, assuming that whatever was inside was what should be there, and I had to take their word for it. But having this level of understanding, it helps me as a security provider or an asset owner to be able to understand what is inside. Again, not that you're necessarily going to change it, but at least I know what to protect. Where do I need to put in a firewall rule or restrict access in this way, or how am I going to interconnect these things? And knowing all those things helps me better understand what I need to do to protect it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I did exactly that when I worked at a large airline. And you think of airlines as, I mean, they are the most integrated industry possibly known for convergence. But they had a lot of software coming in. And at periods of high availability, they wanted to know what was being added. And it was even more so if it was inside of PCI environments. For the credit card payment industries, you have certain criteria of how you're going to patch. And then if you can't because of a third-party component, then you have to write risk exception letters that day and basically shape and form, because your next PCI scan is going to automatically show you that anyway. So you have to do those things proactively, and it's a painful piece of the security theater, but it was very important to know what was going in and out, and actually having a level of due diligence and transparency for your auditors, because at least you can demonstrate that you've done some due care.
Yeah,
and that's crucial. And we've not done that. And I don't know when we stopped being engineers and doing that and paying attention to the small details, but we did. And now it's our time to correct that, despite 3 decades of advocating for this.
Well, like you said, though, it's that engineering. The engineers were focused on, hey, I need to build my control loop, and I need to build this automation and this endpoint. But like you said, right, as they started bringing IT and they started bringing commercially off-the-shelf products and Microsoft and Log4j, all those things started being part of that solution. Whereas before that, it was all a custom, out-of-box, proprietary solution. But it stopped being that a long time ago, right? And the engineers never put that part. They still just said, oh, the vendor's doing that. I don't have to worry about that, right? They pushed that risk off on the vendors. But the vendors weren't actually receiving that risk. You, as the asset owner and the company, still own that risk. You're just assuming that risk is taken care of by the vendors. You mentioned the CISO in the news right now with SolarWinds. I'll go ahead and say it. Being sued by the SEC because they say they lied to stakeholders about vulnerabilities that were in there, right? Whether that's true or not, that's not what I'm trying to focus on. But the point is that this is not the first time SolarWinds has been in the news for incidents, right? And it's every vendor is going to have things they don't know about, right? So whether or not he knew or not, that's not the point. The point is that every vendor is going to have vulnerabilities. Every environment's going to have vulnerabilities. You have to know that those are there. You have to assume that they're there. Maybe they did a great job and they blocked them and they're hard to find, but it's impossible to make something perfect. Like, humans are not perfect. There's no reason to expect that their code is going to be perfect, right?
and especially after periods of gold rushes. Yeah. So, if we think about where a big portion of the off-the-shelf automation really came from, I mean, the oil sands and the oil industry are a big portion of that. If you look in the 80s and stuff, and 90s, when the price of oil was really high, they're like, everybody in their garage had an automation company in the 80s, pretty much. And look at the mess it made. Yep. Now, after some of those acquisitions, a lot of the vendors have had to weed those products out and end of life them and produce slightly better replacements. Now look at the renewables industry, another gold rush of disasters. Yep. And so you're seeing everybody rush to market, not caring what's going on in those joint ventures. And there's some big top tier industrial vendors that have made that mistake on very, very large turbines. What happens when you do a joint venture and one of the partners degrades your security on something that shouldn't be degraded? They've gone through that and they're still going through it. Now look at wind and solar. And you have different geopolitical aspects to wind and solar now, with various different countries and companies. And that's not being exposed. So you're going to have to deal with, you can't rip and replace the turbine's control system, because why would you even keep the turbine around if you're going to go rip it all out? Right. So you're going to live with it, unless you can go sell that terrible set of assets off to the next poor asset owner who doesn't do their due diligence on M&A, which there's a prime point here. You should maybe know what you're M&Aing when you're doing assets, instead of it just looking at the revenue capacity or the tax credits. Those are all big pieces here of that whole equation. We're in the next big rush, and let me tell you, this rush doesn't look so clean.
Yeah. Yeah, and man, that's a huge point, right? Is making sure that you're looking at it, whether it's an M&A perspective, whether it's you're just looking at existing fleet that you have. Are you pulling that trigger, right? Or are you pulling that string? I guess is a better way to say it, right? Are you really looking at what is the risk to my? All of this leads back to risk, right? And it's business risk. It's not just cyber risk. So in the cyber world, all of our vendors, all of our folks we're talking about, China and Stuxnet and all the different things. But really, all of these things bubble up to risk, and it's business risk, right? And if you can't correlate the things that we're talking about from cyber and from an architecture wise and all that type of stuff, right? If you can't correlate that to a business risk, it's almost impossible to get a board and a C-suite executive to understand it and to put money and dollars in it long term, right? Maybe I can get a capital budget, I stand something up, but if I don't show ROI in the next year or 2 years, okay, maybe that thing gets cut. And I've seen it happen many times over and over again where it just doesn't happen. They don't renew, they don't do it because, nothing happened. I don't see value in that. You're not showing me any reports. I'm just going to end support for that. Like, we're not going to do that anymore. But and in my opinion, that's less a problem of maybe it was bad technology, maybe you bought a crappy product, or maybe just nobody knew how to use it and was able to pull the value out to be able to translate that and correlate that to that C-suite executive, to the board, to be able to say, hey, this is what we have, this is why we have it, and this is the value it's providing and the business risk that we're either mitigating or watching for to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's all that business risk. You're totally right. So, like, for example, here's a really good one. You're still running layer 2 switches, or you've capped out your gigabit uplink. You've got a really good opportunity there to go to your boss and say, I would like 4 gigabit, 10 gigabit uplinks and new fiber runs, not just for the purposes of security and for today, but what will that get us tomorrow? Oh, that's going to get us 4K cameras everywhere. That's going to get you virtualized and distributed snapshots for running VMware clusters, which means we can get booted up very quickly. We can do RDS farms. We can do all those things. Oh, what does that mean? Does that mean that we can get rid of a couple of the old operator workstations and put them into one control room and minimize, let's say, 1 FTE? Possibly. It's not a discussion anybody likes, but at least you can justify the case, which is we can actually get improved visibility on a facility. We can make sure that, for improved safety on walkarounds, we can go spot the visitor from all points. All of a sudden, that's a different conversation of, oh, I need a whole bunch of budget for new switches because I need some passive anomaly detection tool. You sell it in a very different perspective that makes sense for the business. Everything else afterwards, because we have this, we can do this, and there's no extra implementation needed. Oh, wow, great, sold, because actually I can actually say that my total cost of ownership estimates are closer to being realistic versus, by the way, if you're going to put in X technology, you need to rip out everything and network or reorchestrate. That's all of a sudden your general manager and everybody's just going to say no, because that's going to be all of a sudden a $2 or $3 million teardown.
Right.
So you can always stage it and think, very strategically. And that's, I guess that's part of our job, is to help those people that need to make those decisions have the adequate business knowledge to communicate that, I guess.
So we talked about a couple of scenarios. You talked about M&A. You talked about, as greenfield or control system upgrades. What are some other ways that you guys are able to show that business value and that business risk reduction, et cetera, and really translate that to these companies and these entities to understand where the risks are or justify, hey, we need to do more or choose a different product, right?
Yeah, so we were used by a top 5 oil major to do product comparisons for them. So they looked at 3 different vendors. 1 vendor did not participate, but 2 did. And we actually we gave each vendor complete transparency. Nobody wants to have that researcher or a company saying, here's all the 50 problems wrong with your product. So we built this collaborative safe space for each one of the vendors with that OEM, with that oil major. And we actually showed measurable change and reduction of risks in the product. So things that you'd find in the NIST SP 800-160 document. We actually helped reduce some of those items there with that transparency there. So we helped work with the asset owner and their vendors, and we made something measurable within just a span of like a month and a half. So that's an interesting use case that's not so common, but on a procurement piece for designing new systems. The other places, we actually help provide attestation for OEMs. that at least when the product was going out the door, all of these basic criteria were met. So this is very different than 62443 certifications as well. This is more from an engineering perspective on the cyber-based and the software components that are inside. Are those equated to, and can you account for all of them, and many other things? So there's that use case.
Right.
Another interesting case is the last mile. So if you have NERCs at 010 and 013, you'll know how did that software get there and what was the journey that it took. Right. I hate to tell you, when there's an emergency, your engineers are going to go grab stuff left, right, and center off of Google. They don't care. They'll turn off firewalls. They'll ignore every alarm.
Yep.
So having validated stores on site, so software being scanned in there and being compared to, let's say, our data lake as a form of attestation. There's a very large company that does that. We have all of their golden releases. So their services team submit to us and we provide back that product might be end of life. Go look for a knowledge base article that will point you in the right direction for the latest version. Or at least this is legitimate. So maybe a hot fix slipped out the back door. It's been known to happen in many organizations. They'll catch it that way, or they might even, that OEM might catch files in the wild as well. So there's kind of that point. And another way that you don't normally see us, but we are involved in, is for USB kiosk scanning. And so our data lake is often used for false positive reductions for software entering facilities. So it's much easier to look for what's good versus what's bad and lock out what you don't know. In this case, we're being used in that for that respect to reduce the false positive rates for a very large OEM by at least 10%. So that, which when you think about is a lot of tech support calls and a lot of angry people saying, I can't get my work order done, that 10% adds up real quick to real dollars and value. So we're used in a number of different ways. But really, it's to provide transparency and integrity on software, really.
Well, and that is so huge. So you just talked about it like it was nothing, but the blacklist versus whitelist, right? And being able to know, hey, this is good. Everything else is assumed bad. And versus I'm looking for these particular signatures of bad things, which is great, but that changes every day. That changes multiple times in a day. I used to support a nuclear power plant, and we had two incidents over two different outage refueling cycles where the vendor brought in their laptop and went through the kiosk and scanned it for viruses and all that type of thing, plugged in, updated the PLC on a crane. And then, when they were gone, we re-scanned the system and ended up, it was just acting weird. And then we took the code off and replaced it with the previous version and all that kind of stuff. And then we took that off for scanning and realized it had a malware on it, right? How did it get in? Like, we went through all the right check boxes that we were supposed to. It got green lights. We had all of the evidence around that. So we just okay, well, probably wasn't a signature that we could detect. And then the next outage, it happened again. The same vendor brought the same laptop in and did the same thing again. And again, we didn't detect it. It was a different version. But again, we still didn't detect it because we were looking for bad. And it was a signature that wasn't part of the list. So we were looking for all the bad things and it didn't show up on any of those bad lists. So we just assumed it was good. We being the system, right? So that's a powerful thing to do, and it's really hard to do whitelisting in OT. But this is a really powerful way to do it that doesn't impact your environment, right? You're able to look at those software libraries, and it's not impacting my operations. But I'm able to do that with a lot less false positives. But also, you're able to detect exactly what should be on there versus the infinite number of bad things it can list that hopefully you have the one that happens to be on that drive, right?
Exactly. And then there's other cases. So we were brought in because there's a really big skid maker that had a customer that was really worried that they would bring in something. And imagine you're that skid maker. I don't think you have enough liability insurance for a malware to come in and you to get blamed for it, especially in a Fortune 100. I don't think you have enough liability to even deal with this. So you have, it's really the onus is on you to between SAT and FAT. Yep. Here's what was on my images. Here was on my laptops. And then from that point forward, especially if you're providing services, to provide posterity on the images, or in many facilities where you can't run endpoint scans, you have to pull your backups out into a land where they can be scanned by people like us to go provide that breakdown so you can get insights. And actually that's very useful for sites that are self-managed, quote unquote, where the general managers don't give you knowledge. At least you can export out backups and get some insights into what's going behind that iron curtain in some of those facilities. It's not to get mad at people. It's really to expose and try and highlight, hey, looks like, you've got some old assets over there. Can we scrummage up some budget to try and help you out to retrofit that? Right. And that being the key piece of the fight between IT and OT is IT always says they'll help, or corporate will say they'll help. Yeah, they never actually follow that up with real dollars. Right. But on the day that they do follow up with dollars, you're going to have a friend for life at that point, for the right reasons. So really, it's to help expose, get that dollar amount out, and being able to assess. And it's going to be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean that's a great use case, right? It's so, these OT spaces are so different, and just the way they're run, and we talked about how old they are and all that kind of stuff. And you may have a site that you're managing, but you don't own the asset. You're just a manager of it, or the inverse. So there's all these different factors that make it hard to do all of these things. And there's segmentation everywhere, and you can't touch things, you can't install anything, you can't do all this stuff because the vendors will not support it. So there's all these struggles. Like on IT, you would never bring a laptop into an IT organization and connect it to the Wi-Fi without it having all the things, the antivirus and the endpoint scanner and all the different things, or they're just not going to let you on. They're going to, knack you off to some subnet that's not going to let you go anywhere, and they're going to kick you off or boot you, whatever the thing is. You can't do that in OT because it can break stuff. And it's more important for availability, but that brings all these inherent risks. So how do we overcome this? And this is a way that you can do that in a safe way. When you're talking about a backup, I'm not impacting the production system. I'm doing it offline. It's secure. It's safe. It's no risk to the business as far as operations goes. And it's a way that you can get really good insight into what's going on in my production environment without impacting. The vendor can't be pissed about it. Like there's no losers in this situation.
Exactly. And if anything, it's going to help you broach a difficult conversation. Right. And that's crucial, right? You can't go to your vendor and be like, I think your product sucks. That's not going to go very far. But what you can say is your product has these IOGs, and I'd like to have your input on that, and how could we work together? Because, and I could quote out the service contract and say, you said you're going to do this. That's probably not what you'd want to do, but it's more like, here's some things. What are we doing to address that together? And it makes us all sing the same song, hopefully. So and the trends are changing. So
have you seen any? How much have you seen on the vendor side openness to work directly with you guys and do that going up front instead of having customers come behind and say, hey, look what I found? Are we starting to see a tide change on the vendor side to do this up front and really have that third-party attestation of, hey, look, we had a third party come in and look at our stuff. These are the things they found versus, and these is how we fixed it, all that kind of stuff?
So there's a couple of different ones there. On the asset owner side, if it's a new facility that is going to be planned out before even the POs and the product selections go out, that's a lot easier discussion versus here's what's ongoing and here's all the terrible things in those choices, because nobody's going to want to hear it and know, especially if there's shareholders involved. You got to make sure that facility is going to get up in operation. You're going to pick up the bodies and the pieces on the other side. That's what's going to happen no matter what. But on the new facilities, that's a whole other thing. On vendor side, it really depends. So some are very forward leaning and some believe in the democratization of data. And some are more old school and don't want to share a thing. There's business, and to be really fair, there's no business is homogenous. So there's different business units that might be more modern and more open facing, and others that are like, don't touch this because you don't know what other industries we're working in. Those ones are understandable. I can foresee their hesitance and understand it. But generally speaking, it's the more modern ones that are looking for due diligence, looking for ways to get hands on how, especially on products that are multiple business units pulled together. Some of those product owners really want to know what's going on so they can start removing contractors out of the next builds or minimizing their attack services and minimizing their tech support and their patching cadences because of that. So those vendors, those OEMs, they're ahead. But if I had 100 of them, I bet you there's not that many that look like that.
Yeah.
So it's really collaborative as well. On the IoT or Internet of Things, industrial, whatever, there's a bit of push there. But again, that comes back to this whole greenfield thing is they all know that the hardware is not going to be there because they're not buying in quantities that matter. Right. So they're going to be producing a new product every 2 or 3 years anyway. So they don't care. So those ones, there's a little bit less traction more so, but the ones that know they're going to be there for the haul or let's say, actually PCI is going to be fun in 2025. 4.0 is coming out and asking for SBOMs. That's, there's going to be pushes, but so far the vendor side, there's just not that many that are that advanced on their maturity scale. At least that's been my case.
Yeah, I mean, you just talked about that on the SBOM side, right? And you see Cisco in the news here recently with all these vulnerabilities that came out. And again, like we said earlier, right, those Cisco switches are living in the OT space. Like there's really old Catalyst switches that are running. I remember installing, 2960Gs, that were end of life when we installed them. And that was 12 years ago. And they're probably still running, right? Probably still running on the same iOS version that they were when I installed them, because that's the way OT works. So all of these things, you're just compounding the issues across time and facilities and lack of resources and understanding of what these spaces are. It just becomes so much more complex. And once they're there, it's impossible, or not impossible, but very difficult to do any change and rip them out, put in something newer, or even just updating a firmware, right? Updating the iOS version on a Cisco switch is hard, because the people that are, Emerson or whomever that installed them, or, somebody like me that installed them, is no longer around. And if it breaks, I don't have anybody to support it. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just leave it alone and don't look at it wrong.
Pretty much. It's like, I think I saw a joke about a Halloween costume that was saying if you're an industrial network architect, and it was basically kind of a satire piece saying like, on site with perfect network diagrams, and there's just an empty piece of paper, right? And I was just like, yeah, that's exactly it. Like,
they don't exist. It's a mythical creature.
So it's a mythical creature indeed. So that was, some good chuckles for sure out of that stuff, but that's it. I mean, even on the software product side, the reason why you want transparency, especially between builds, is you can see who's actively maintaining your product. It's not very commonly known that when you get a brand new product, quote unquote, brand new, it already has almost no resources working on it when it's released, because that is the way product ROI works for big companies. Very few people maintain. So you have possibly contractors, a business unit, some knowledgeable SMEs that are like, hey, we need to have a product that does these specs with this software, this real-time nature, these requirements. They build you a product. Maybe they're going to port on some first-party code, but they're going to do the bare minimum to get it to boot. And then they're going to put software on top of it, and there's your brand new product. Okay, so that goes into release candidate testing and all those things and verification. And then what will happen is that crew might stay around on contract for, let's say, 3 months or maybe 1 or 2 releases. And then after that, there might be a skeleton crew that maintains it. And then you bought this product that's brand new, and it's already end of life before you bought it. I mean, how is that fair? I don't know. But by getting transparency on that from the moment before you're going to purchase, and you do purchase in every update, you will start to spot some interesting things about capitalism that you probably didn't wish you knew.
Yeah, there's a lot of divestitures, like you talked about before, right? There's companies that are getting bought. Splunk got bought by Cisco, and all these different Verve got bought by Rockwell, and Rockwell has this thing with Clarity, and all of these things that are happening. And I've been in IT a long time, and I've seen Cisco buy products, and then they just shelf them and they go there to die, right? So you're gonna have a lot of these integrations that you don't have a choice on. You bought this thing, and then there was some M&A in the background, and now they're not supporting it anymore. They're not doing any they're doing bare minimum support to make sure it doesn't die, but they're not adding any resources to it. They're not doing R&D. They're not upkeeping it like you would want them to do, and that's going to impact you long term. Tripwire. I mean, again, the list goes on and on and on and on of products that are like that, and that's where the customer, the asset owners, need to be up to, but how could they possibly be up to date on every product they have in their environment, much less their fleet? It's an overwhelming thing, unless they potentially had some way to search that and understand what all is there and be able to look that up on the fly. And unfortunately, there's very few folks that have that level of insight into their environments.
Or the bodies to even take care of that knowledge. Right. It's like threat intelligence. Unless you have a body that understands what that threat is and why it's relevant to them, and most of the threat intelligence is not relevant to you when you're purchasing it. And then you need to know actually how to action that. It's not just about one facility; it could be many. And how do you put that all into play? And I mean, supply chain insights And third-party risk assessments and TPRAs, I mean, it's kind of in that realm, but do you have enough bodies to do anything about it? And I mean, you're starting to move towards a high maturity curve of companies that can care, much less be able to have a stick big enough to hit back with.
Exactly. All right, so we talked all over the place here, so I always like to close this up with the question, and it's the same one I always ask. It's, in the next 5 to 10 years, what's something that you're excited about coming up over the horizon, and maybe something that you're concerned about? We probably already talked about 2 or 3 that would match that criteria, but I'll leave it to you.
I'll start with the biggest one that's probably the most concerning right now is the Linux Foundation's choice to get rid of long-term support kernels. Yep. I think that is going to be one of the biggest things that's going to hurt us, because everyone already forgets what's inside the software and the supporting stuff and doesn't update it. I guarantee you nobody's going to backport stuff now. Right. So this is going to be really bad news if you're running a Linux appliance, and if you're an OEM, expect your maintenance costs to go through the roof if you actually do care about what's inside your product. So that concerns me, among the many things. What I'm really excited about, I think, is the usage of things like Rust. Other programming languages that are doing contract-based things. It's no substitute for other languages and so on, but in certain cases, I think it'll be really good moving forward. And I'm hoping that some of the underlying pieces will be tied to other things. Like, you won't have to think about, let's say, the PLC top 10 programming things you can do. That'll be already enforced by contracting languages. So maybe any of those, the isographs and all of that will be kind of bubbled into the same thing, and we won't have to think about it anymore of applying that framework on a framework. I'm really excited for that ubiquitization of proper engineering practices starting to happen. But I don't know what its uptake will be, but I'm pretty excited about that's and then solving this namespace.
Yeah, that's what do you know? Some kind of framework you can build upon instead of having to reinvent the wheel. That's impressive. But the Linux thing is it's hit us for sure, because we were using open source Linux and long-term support, et cetera, and we've adjusted and went to RHEL because of that exact thing. Like, we need to pay for the enterprise license so that we can get support long-term. We're and it is increasing our costs on the back end. It's not huge, but it is a cost, and exponential, over all of our sensors and every one of our devices, it's an impact, right? But it was a choice that we had to make. But are all vendors going to make that choice? Probably not, right? A lot of them will just stick with it and say, we'll do with what we got.
They'll use whatever was in the board support package that they bought.
Exactly, right, which will be very limited and long-term support. But again, in OT, and the reason why we made that choice obviously is in OT, we may have sensors that are sitting out there for 5 or 10 years. Like, we can't have one that's not supported. That's not the space we live in, and we want our customers to be supported long-term. So that was the only right decision for us, and hopefully enough vendors. But that's a question you should be asking as an asset owner, is looking at that. What is the long-term support? Are you using Linux in the back end? Okay. Which version of Linux are you using? Do you have long-term support beyond, 18 months, which most of these are probably not going to have. All right, man. So what do you got coming up? I know we're going to be doing some cool stuff at S4 and all sorts of fun things going on. So just a quick side note, guys, is Ron and I were at GridSecCon in Canada. A whole bunch of flight things that I don't even have to get into, but canceling flights and booking flights and problems with rebooking on wrong dates. In fact, I would have just returned from no, I wouldn't have even. I'd still be in Canada right now if I'd have actually waited for the flight that I had originally, because it was November 17th and today's the 3rd. So I'd still be sitting in Canada. Not exactly sure what I'd be doing this whole time. But Ron was nice enough to actually drive me from Quebec City, which not a whole lot of flights from Quebec City to Austin. But Ron actually drove me all the way to Quebec, to Montreal. So took me to the airport, met his wife and his dog and all the things, fed me dinner. It was awesome. So it's amazing to see the community that we have in the small space, and building these relationships, going to these conferences and doing all this stuff it's awesome. Like, I enjoy this stuff. I enjoy making these connections and having conversations like this. is what is going to take us to the next level. It's what's going to get us past these ruts. These we've done it this way for 40 years. Like molding of our ideals and being open to consider a different way, a potentially better way, or at least look at, hey, what are my shortcomings? What am I missing in my assumptions that maybe you have perspective on and 15 other people do? Together we're stronger than we are just, hey, I'm the smartest guy in the room, my way's going to work, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a Tour de France, and I'm glad that you made it for that 3 hours. We were driving through B roads, and you're like, "What is this mountain over here? Is this a garbage dump? I've never seen a land so flat." That was a beautiful 24 hours. But you're right, though. It's about the community. I mean, I couldn't be where I am without friends, and I couldn't imagine a lot of people being potentially where they are without other friends. So like in the upcoming week, I'm going to be in Denmark over there speaking to a totally different side of the world, sharing knowledge that I've acquired over my many journeys. And those people hopefully will be doing the same, because, what might work well for North America might not work well for Europe. But maybe there's something to be shared and to be learned. And that's how I like to operate. So next week I'll be in Denmark for B-sides, and then I'm going to be a participant for once, not actually speaking, at ISC CPH in Denmark, just to go hang out with everybody and see what's going on and what's new, and hopefully we can all share some war stories beyond seeing the typical marketing dribble that's on stages.
Exactly. To that point, we've got some cool stuff coming up in the vulnerability pavilion that's coming up in S4, and I'm sure Ron and I will have some stuff to share out at some point. But excited about all that's coming up in the future, and working with great companies, and really with the focus of bringing value to the end user, so that, I mean, at the end of the day, I say it all the time, but when I turn my light switch on, I want it to work. So I want to empower the asset owners to have the knowledge and the tools and the capabilities they need to be able to keep my power working, my water working, all of those things that we all just take for granted on it, or many people do, at least. I think probably you and I don't, because we know what goes into making the sausage in the background. But I definitely want that stuff to keep working. And again, working with good companies like you guys is how it's going to happen. We're all stronger together as a community by bringing our capabilities together to be able to protect. We all have really the same focus of protection, availability, cost, all that kind of stuff. We want it to be available for our entities, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, hey, man, I look forward to buying you a beer at S4, and maybe I'll drive you to the airport this time.
Yeah, maybe exactly. Or I'll see you before then. S4 being in March, so there's lots that can happen between then and now.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thanks again for your time today. I enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure we'll do it again.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.